Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a chapter of medical history that is heavy, deeply unsettling, and absolutely vital to understand. We're talking about the U.S. Public Health Service Untreated Syphilis Study at Tuskegee. It's a story about a staggering breach of trust and what happens when systems prioritize raw data over human life. So let's get right into the facts. Just imagine this for a second. What if a government medical study found a guaranteed cure right in the middle of their research, but then deliberately kept it a total secret from their patients? It sounds unthinkable, right? Well, that's exactly what happened here. And it wasn't some quick lapse in judgment. This experiment lasted an unbelievable 40 years, stretching from 1932 all the way to 1972. Sources widely describe it as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this, let's look at the timeline. The whole thing kicks off in 1932. Then, right smack in the middle, 1947, penicillin becomes the recommended go-to treatment. A real cure exists. But the study doesn't stop. Unbelievably, it just keeps going for another 2.5 decades until 1972. It's honestly hard to even fathom that kind of timeline for simply observing people suffer. Part 1. The problem: bad blood and false promises. So, who was actually targeted for this? 600 men. Specifically 600 Black men living in the deeply segregated South. We really have to emphasize this racial dimension because it's a heavily documented, central part of the historical record. You had a government agency running an experiment on a deeply vulnerable, marginalized population during an era of extreme systemic inequality. Now let's break down those numbers a bit. Out of those 600 guys, 399 already had syphilis when they were enrolled, while the other 201 made up an uninfected control group. But here is the massive, foundational failure of the whole operation. Informed consent was never, ever collected from a single one of them. Not one man was actually told what the real purpose of the study was. Instead of the truth, researchers used a total deception. They told the men they were being treated for bad blood, which was really just a local catch-all term back then for things like anemia, fatigue, and syphilis. They made these huge promises: free medical exams, free hot meals, and even free burial insurance. But the grim reality? There was no actual treatment. The men were just being watched as a fatal disease progressed. They literally exploited these men's trust just to keep their research dataset intact. Part 2. The agitate: withholding the cure. Okay, this brings us to a massive turning point. By 1947, a genuine, proven cure was on the table. Penicillin was widely available, highly recommended, and incredibly effective against syphilis. This was about 15 years into the experiment. Normal medical ethics, common sense, human decency, all of that dictates you halt the study and cure the men, right? But no. The researchers made a deliberate, documented choice to basically look the other way and not offer penicillin to any of the participants. And honestly, it gets even worse. They didn't just fail to hand over the medicine themselves. According to the historical record, public health researchers actively convinced local physicians in Macon County not to treat the participants independently. Think about the active malice there. They didn't just withhold the cure. They literally stepped in to block outside doctors from saving these men's lives. They completely trapped them. So, what were the men actually getting? Well, while they fully believed they were receiving state-of-the-art medical care, they were actually being handed placebos, stuff like aspirin and basic mineral supplements. All the while, researchers were meticulously tracking their downward spiral. These men suffered through blindness, insanity, and all the horrific, ravaging effects of late-stage syphilis, entirely unaware that a real cure was being kept just out of their reach. The human cost of that specific cover-up is just devastating. By the time this was all over, more than 100 participants had died directly because of it. Sources show 28 dying straight from syphilis and about 100 more from related complications. But the ripple effect, it expanded way beyond those original 600 men. At least 40 spouses contracted syphilis from husbands who were never treated. And incredibly, tragically, the disease was passed on to 19 children at birth. Part 3. The deeper layer: breaking the silence. You're probably wondering, how on earth did a secret this massive stay buried for 40 years? And who finally pulled the plug? Well, it started in the mid-60s. A venereal disease investigator based in San Francisco named Peter Buxton found out about the study. He sounded the alarm internally, but his superiors completely brushed him off. Feeling like he had no other choice, Buxton took a huge gamble and leaked the story to a friend in the press. Ultimately, Associated Press reporter Gene Heller blew the story wide open in July of 1972. The internal government watchdogs failed completely. It literally took one guy's conscience and some fierce investigative journalism to force their hand. It was only then, in 1972, that the study officially ended. They put together an advisory panel, but let's be real, that only happened in direct response to the story hitting the papers. It was the massive public outrage from that media exposure that was finally powerful enough to shut the whole thing down. Part 4. The Resolution. A lasting ethical legacy. With the public totally outraged, the government finally had to move. In 1973, Congress held formal hearings. A massive class action lawsuit led to a $10 million out-of-court settlement in 1974. That also paved the way for the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program. Eventually, they expanded that program to cover not just the surviving men, but their wives, widows, and kids, trying to offer at least some measure of medical restitution for all that generational damage. Still, it took decades to get a real apology from the very top. Finally, on May 16, 1997, literally 65 years after the study started and 25 years after it ended, President Bill Clinton gave a formal presidential apology on behalf of the U.S. government. Along with that apology came funding to set up the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University, which is dedicated to making absolutely sure research ethics violations like this never happen again. And that brings us to something that directly impacts every single one of us today: institutional review boards, or IRBs. These are the strict ethics oversight committees that legally govern pretty much all human medical research in the United States right now. So, if you go sign up for a clinical trial tomorrow, the strict informed consent laws that protect you, those trace their existence directly back to the regulatory overhaul sparked by the Tuskegee scandal. But we absolutely cannot write this off as just ancient history. Actually, according to recent CDC reporting, around 10 of the participants' children are still receiving medical and health benefits through that program today. There are living, breathing descendants whose lives and health are still tangibly tied to an experiment that kicked off nearly a century ago. Which leaves us with one incredibly powerful, lingering thought. If it took 40 years, an incredibly brave whistleblower, and a massive media leak to stop the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings, how do we make absolutely sure that our modern medical systems never prioritize data over human dignity again? The ethical frameworks we lean on today were built directly on the suffering of those 600 men. It's on us to understand this history, to keep talking about it, and to make sure it is never, ever forgotten. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.